Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I want to say good afternoon and hello to everyone that's here. Glad you took the time out of your schedule to come. Again, it's a privilege and it's a great honor to have been asked by the Friends, Beaufort County, Friends of the Beaufort County Library and by Mr. Scott Gibbs. It is indeed an honor. The title of the book, as you can see, You're Going to Be Somebody, by Helen Smith. J.M. Coberland from Destiny Images gives us a snapshot of Helen Smith's book and what we can expect in that book. It's a dramatic story and a personal testimony of Apostle Helen Smith, whom I knew personally. Her testimony begins with her childhood memories in the South during the 1930s and follows her painful experiences as she fights to be somebody through racial, economic, and religious barriers. Helen's dramatic dreams, visions, and angelic visitation is a golden thread, and it builds a bridge between what she termed painful and often tragic realities in her life and the heavenly promises that God made her. Apostle Helen Smith, as she's called, in her story conveys a message of personal success along with her testimony, which declares her perseverance in the face of intense persecution and suffering. Defying all odds and circumstances, she relies upon the words of her mother, "You're going to be somebody." And through God's faithfulness and those words, everything comes to pass. And today, Helen is somebody. So while reading her book, I found some rich historical facts and African American traditions and way of life that brought many memories back to me. I will read some excerpts from the book, from her story, as well as summarize certain portions of her story. I found this book to be encouraging, exhilarating, and intriguing. And I cannot give it all to you because of the allotted time, but I will give you some of it. In the table of contents, Helen talks about growing up down home. She talks about her escape to Charleston, the beginning of sorrow, seeking to know God, and their revival in Cainhoy. And Cainhoy is in Charleston, South Carolina. Growing up down home, they call her Ellen in the book, but her name is Helen. I like Ellen's descriptive and expressive words. She was able to imagine her brother on this journey. I was able, to imagine her brother on this journey and their home life on the plantation. And this is what she begins with. She shows us a vivid picture of her brother driving an imaginary car. I don't know if anybody here can relate to that, to the store. As he runs, he's imitating the sound of an automobile while using the wheel of a tricycle. He does not care about the heat nor the dust. He just wants to get to the store as fast as he can to pick up what his mother had told him to. In his heart, he knows that one day he will actually drive that car that only exists in his imagination. He enters that country store and asks to be served. He pays for the goods, and now he is off again, back into his imaginary car, driving at full speed. He stops by the wayside and parks his car and began to pick some blueberries and some sugar plums. And is only about 6 miles to the store and back. With his mouth blue, he returns home, and he empties his pockets of some of the blueberries and some of the sugar plums. And he also put on the table all that his mother sent him to the store for. Then he's off to the fields to join the others. Mama, and I found later in the book, way down in the book, her name was Maddie. That's Helen's mom. She's cooking dinner on the old wood stove in the small kitchen. The temperature is in the 90s. The tin roof adds about 10 more degrees to that, and the wood stove adds another 30 to 40 degrees. But Mama is not bothered by all that heat. She is busy cooking a pot of rice while she's snapping the beans that she just shelled. She adds a piece of the side meat that she cured herself with only salt. And when the side meat is cooked down, she is going to add some fresh okra that she picked right out of her field. Mama thinks, well, it doesn't make sense to just waste this heat and let this wood go to waste. So she goes and she gets 2 sheets, and those are made out of rice sacks, and she covers half of the table, and she puts 3 old irons turned down on the stove, and when they're hot, she irons a stack of clothes. As Helen goes on, she reflects on the stories that her mama told her about cities that she had lived in and the people that she worked for. Her mama told her about being born in 1905 on the Whole Bunny Plantation, where she worked for Mrs. Mangum. And Mrs. Mangum was one of the daughters of the plantation owner. And I did a little research when I saw Whole Bunny Plantation, and she was between Hampton County, Beaufort County, and Charleston. That's where Helen lived. So when I researched the Whole Bunny Plantation, it says Whole Bunny Plantation, and it still exists. It's in Yamasee. It's located on the Combahee River. It was established in 1733, and it was used for rice cultivation until after the end of the Civil War. So with Helen's grandmother's permission, Helen's mom went to live in Charleston with Mrs. Mangum because Helen was good friends with her daughter Anne. So there were 2 things that Helen's mom requested of Mrs. Mangum. Number 1 is that she would teach Maddie, which is Helen's mom, to read and write, and that she would take good care of her daughter. Mrs. Mangum kept her word. She taught Helen's mom to read and write, and she was planning to send her to nursing school. Well, the plan was changed because Maddie's mom, which was Helen's grandmother, got sick. Maddie had to move back home to take care of her and her little brother and sister. Her grandmother died shortly thereafter, and her stepfather, who was there for a while, decided that he was going to leave. So here is Maddie, Helen's mom, who had the responsibility as a young girl of taking care of her siblings. Less than 2 years later, due to some illness or some plague that was going around the family, her sister died. Helen states that only prayer helped her brother to recover. Her mom could not find the kind of work that she was used to with Mrs. Mangum. So she took to doing farm work. Of course, she was teased because before she had this nice job, so now she had to work on the farm just like her other people around her and her relatives. But she behaved differently. She came from she was reared in a different environment. And she was not going to indulge in what they wanted her to do, to indulge in some sexual activity. But one night, because they thought that Helen's mom thought that she was too good, a young man sneaked in the house and he raped her. She was too embarrassed to tell anyone, but a pregnancy was a result of that. Helen, being naive like she was, Helen's mom, Maddie, she did not realize when she was getting sick what was wrong with her until finally her aunt told her. Then she became the laughing stock of that area. She began to feel so cheap, but she continued to work. When the season was over on the plantations and there was no work, she worked on the Crest Flowers farm for 50 cents a day, from sunrise to sunset, walking from 8 to 10 miles. And she frequently began to think about the carefree life that she had in Charleston when she lived with Mrs. Mangum. Then she also thought that there's a God up above, as she's heard her mama say, and that trouble don't last always. And those are the two things that helped her to continue. Mama Maddie, as I'm going to call her so we can differentiate the difference, gave birth to a baby girl, and her name was Millie. As a custom, she spent 2 weeks in the home of a midwife until she gained her strength. So now she had 2 babies, her brother and little Millie. So she soon found, because she wasn't getting along with those on the farm, she soon found a white family to work for. And she moved into their cottage, and she worked there Monday through Friday, half day on Saturday, off on Sundays, for $2.50 a week. Helen continues to give us a view of her life at home. And for the Christmas season, they mix flour and water to make a thin starch to put on the walls on newspapers. They use mostly comic strip. But with that newspaper, it gave them something pretty. It also gave them something to read. And also, it took away the draft in the wintertime. And when I read that, I'm like, oh, we used to do that. Keeping the house clean meant so much to them. This is the way they did it. They scrubbed the floors on their knees with lye soap and a brush. They also used a tall grass to make a broom to sweep. And this was something new to me. They beat up red bricks to give the floors a pink color. So reading was important to Helen and her mom, so she taught all of her children how to read, and she taught them by the kerosene light. Every book Helen found was interesting. They knew that, as Mama said, there were going to be somebody, whomever that was. And as we look at Helen's school days, school was an adventure for her. Her sister and brother, Millie and Dickie, took turns going to school. And I can relate to this because I hear my mama tell the same story, that she and her brother not only took turns going to school, but they took turns wearing the same shoes to school. So someone had to be home to take care of the children, is why they took turns going to school. They had to walk at least 6 miles. The blacks were not allowed to ride the bus. So when Helen started school, she was an A student because her mama had taught her. Their school was a Yemassee vocational school that went from primer, which is kindergarten to us, to 12th grade. They had traditions of singing the song, which we don't do anymore, Holy, Holy, Holy in the school, saying a prayer and saluting the flag, and she called it Old Glory. They also, before class, they did all this before class. And one thing they had to do also was to pump water and to use the outdoor toilets. Helen recounts her experiences with racism, starting in some of the welfare system, and how her mom refused to get assistance because of this. She had applied, but the worker harassed her. Not only harassed her when she saw her, but she spied on them. She came to her house, she would walk right in, and she demanded of the children who their father was. And all refused. They kept saying, I don't know. So one day when she saw them walking, they were coming from their mom Brock's house. She saw them with a loaf of bread. So this worker stopped and asked them where they got the bread. And when they told her that Ma Brock gave it to them, well, the next month, Ma Brock did not receive a check. The worker cut her check off because of that. She thought that if she had enough food to give away, then she didn't need the check. So that's racism. Helen writes also about her highs and her lows, life on the farm where they grew potatoes, snap beans, cowpeas, corn, which they grounded into corn grits. They picked cotton for 50 cents a pound or 50 cents per 100 pounds. When their home was lost to a fire and their relocation to a home where a black man owned. She writes about her mom coming to the Mather School sales house, to get clothing for them, and that's where TCL is now. The Ku Klux Klans in Hampton County who made trouble for the blacks. She writes about her sister Millie's near-death illness and about her brother G's fingers being cut off by a neighbor while getting wood. During Helen's adolescent years, her and Millie came to Beaufort County on the train to see their aunt, and they walked from Sheldon to Big Estate. They were quite disappointed, though, because they thought it was so much better here in Beaufort County. When they came to their aunt's house, they had to still pump water, still use an outhouse. So they was really disappointed because they had some preconceived ideas on what life should be when they came. During the storm of the 1940s, Helen remembers the destruction it caused to their small cottage, tearing the majority of the roof off, leaving only a small amount where they could huddle under. They washed out the roads, they uprooted trees, they killed some of their animals. And she remembered that they prayed to God that they would be saved during that storm. But thank God the government declared Hampton County a disaster area, and they were able to get their roof repaired. Helen goes on to talk about when I met God. Helen learned how to pray from her mama and from seeing Mrs. Mangum on her knees praying. Helen resorted to prayer when they had no food, and her mama sent them to Sheldon to the store with a note. She had read a story about a preacher asking God to meet him when he had to face some unpleasant people. So Helen asked God to meet her there, and that the store owner would allow them to credit and get what Mama had on her list. And she met with a kind gentleman at the store. He not only filled the 2 sacks that they took by faith, but he also gave each of them, her and her brother, a Coca-Cola and a sweet roll. So Helen had 2 desires. That one was to know the Lord better, and the other was to move to Charleston. So she began to live in, she terms it, air castles. We call it daydreaming, make-believe world, where she could be anywhere she wanted, could be any person that she wanted to be. So she began withdrawing from people at this time. Helen also tells of her visitation in July of 1944 while she was in the field, and she felt the presence of 2 divine beings. She was not afraid, she felt comfortable, and she was at peace. She was asked by both of them at different times, why don't you get converted? And she finally answered, I will. So while in that cornfield, she prayed the Lord's Prayer, which was mostly what she knew. And she asked God then to teach her to pray. During that next 2 weeks, she had a wonderful time dreaming, as she continued to seek God. Finally, she felt that God was there for her, and she was a new person. That night, God revealed to Helen 3 major events that would take place in her life. The first, she was going to be sick unto death, but in the end, she would be completely healed. The second, she would marry at an early age, and God would send her husband to her. She will know him because the back of his shirt collar would be unusually clean, and his teeth would be white and beautiful. Third, she would not remain true to God, but in a few years she would return to him and serve him with her whole heart. Helen was baptized in October at the age of 16, and that same Sunday, her mama allowed her to leave home. Her cousin Ada and her husband came and picked her up. Her mother gave her $2, which she paid $1.25 to Ada and her husband for the trip, and she had 75 cents left to start her life in Charleston. There in Charleston, she held many jobs as a housekeeper, and she made $6 a week, or sometimes $8.75 a week. She would quit some of those jobs because of her dissatisfaction with her employer, and sometimes being taken advantage of. They did not pay her what they promised. And as a 16-year-old, Helen was a loner until she met Rose, who lived on President Street, which is the other side of town from where she lived. Rose and her began to go to the movies, and Helen, at every chance she got, she went to the movies. She worked from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., and she would not go home. She would go to the movies because of the issues that she had with Ada and her husband. But Helen was yearning to be loved. She heard on the radio, and she started listening to music on the radio. Helen also learned how to dance. In her apartment, a married man who kept seeing her and kind of smitten with her tried to rape her, but she was able to fight him off and get away. But as she continued to look for Mr. Right, the Lord spoke to her and told her that he would find her. Mr. Right would find Helen. Helen did not have to look. So Helen made up her mind how her life would be, and she was determined that those things would come to pass. She was introduced to Mr. Smitty's son, Jimmy, and she did not like him. Though she accepted his invitation to go to the movies, soon they started going out quite frequently. So then, now the courting began. Helen got married to Jimmy September 9th, 1946. In part 3 of this book, The Beginning of Sorrow, details just that. Helen had a lot of sorrows to go through. She had a miscarriage. Jimmy lost his job. They had to move from a 3-bedroom apartment to a 1-room apartment with a small kitchen. And Helen became sick. She did not know what was wrong with her. She was just suffering some severe pains in her neck. Finally, because she had a card when she had her baby, she went to Roper Hospital to the clinic. The clinic opened at 1 p.m. and closed at 5. She went early and stayed there until 5 for weeks and was not seen. When she approached the doctor and begged him to see her because she was so sick, he snatched her card and yelled at her and told her that he had called her name, and she was so busy running her mouth that she did not hear him, which was a lie. So Helen continued to go to see if she could be seen by that doctor. At that clinic, there were hundreds of blacks that came daily to be seen. Sometimes all they would get is, "Come back tomorrow." And in that time, they were discriminated against, because most of them were blacks. If you were not standing when they call your name, have your card in your hand when you came up, and if you moved too slow, they would send you to the back of the line. And most of this fell on the elderly. So they had a hard time doing that. This happened frequently at Roper Hospital. So one weekend, Helen was still sick, but Helen passed out and was taken to the hospital. And this is the second time that she was taken to the hospital. The other time she went, they would not keep her because the clinic will have to refer you to the hospital. But this time they kept her because she was so sick. Helen had an infection in her ankles. She described her ankles as being just as large as her head. And that infection had also grown in her groin area that she found out later on. Helen was in the hospital for quite a while, but she was seen by white doctors and student nurses. And she prayed that the Lord would take away the fever so that she could go home. When she was at the hospital, she kept seeing many visions and dreams, but one stood out to Helen. The Lord was there with his arms open to her. After that, she became more alert because she was semi-conscious. The swelling in her ankle went down and the drainage stopped. 3 weeks after that, the doctor said he was going to put a boot on her feet. and she could go home. But they took x-rays, and when they found out and looked at the x-rays, Helen got some bad news. They found out that Helen had tuberculosis, and she had to be taken to Pine Haven Sanatorium. And to Helen, this was like a death sentence. TB was called consumption in that time, and she did not know anyone who survived it. She saw a lot of horror when they were taken to Pine Haven. There were people there who were hemorrhaging. She had to stay. They made the porch a makeshift room. That's where she stayed, and it was always cold. There she suffered greatly. She's still suffering with pain. She couldn't keep anything down. All she could do was lay there. After making up her mind, she decided she wanted to die. So she had an out-of-body experience. Jesus told her that she must go back and that she would suffer for a long time. In fact, he told her she would suffer for 6 years, and in the end, she would be completely healed. She felt that he also told her, you got to represent me on earth. You've got to tell them about me. So after this experience, Helen came back in her body and realized that she was back in the bed, trapped in that sick body. So she asked the Lord for 3 things. 1, don't let her lose her mind. 2, don't let her have a heart attack. 3, stop her from crying and worrying so much. For more than 4 years, Helen had operations after operations. She went from the hospital back to the sanatorium. And at Roper, everyone knew her, from the orderlies to the chief of staff. And they all was champions for her. They wanted her to get better. The pain grew worse for Helen. So did a mass in her back. Surgery was done to fuse her spine twice, taking a bone from her hip. But her pain level, she describes, that was equal to the last stage of labor pain. And us women can attest to that. Helen became critical for a few weeks. She was put on morphine. She could not eat or drink. And on her hip, the flesh where the surgery was done began to rot. She had a brush with death when her nurse forgot to turn her. And no one was able to call the nurse. She could not speak. But finally, she got the nurse's attention and was able to, the nurse made her cough, and that saved her life. Through it all, Helen got better and was allowed to go home. She still had some pain and some drainage from her hip, but she hid it from everyone. She immersed herself in books and over time decided she needed something to do to bring some income into her home. So she heard an advertisement on the radio, and she wanted to be a cosmetologist. So she completed the hours needed and the exam for her apprenticeship and began to work. Well, she got sick. She got sick several times on the job, but tried to hide it. But after 2 attacks, her employer saw her and put her in a cab and sent her home. So she went to the hospital, and on her 13th surgery, which was on a Thursday morning, she was unconscious. And she heard these words while lying on the stretcher. I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and have the keys of hell and of death. When Helen awoke late that Saturday evening, for the first time in 6 years, she could breathe without pain, and she was not panting for her breath. She heard, I will never forget my doctor's statement. Helen said, you did not take this one like you did the others. You almost left us this time. As soon as we got you on the operating table, you stopped breathing. Your heart stopped beating, and you turned cold on us. But there's something we will never understand. We saw masses of giant TB cells in your back. We've got the x-rays to prove it. Yet, when we cut you open this time, we could find nothing. Not even one trace of TB. A few days later, she was discharged from the hospital. Then, after 6 long years, as Jesus promised, she was healed. Helen then opened a salon on President Street in Charleston. She finished her cosmetology degree, and she was able to bring in money. She held many jobs, many positions, trying to be somebody. She went through many hard times, sicknesses, and excruciating pain. She was not perfect, but she knew how to repent and seek the Lord for help. Helen faced a lot of discrimination from the church as well, but she endured. She was filled with the Holy Ghost and faith. She received the gift of prophecy with gifts of healing and an anointing to cast out demons. The story continues as she went, as commanded by the Lord, to build him a church in Canhoy, which was in Hughie, South Carolina. She began using a little shack to have church. She later, as ordered by the Lord, began her church. She had many struggles, but she also had many blessings. The land, as the Lord commanded to be cleared, he told her not to use any large construction instruments. Helen was later informed why he told her that. The Lord told her that this was done so that every inch of that property would be anointed. So they did a lot of work by their hands. Helen held many revivals where many souls were saved. It was through these revivals that the Lord blessed them with 15 churches. There were 7 in South Carolina, 2 in North Carolina, 1 in Dover, Delaware, 2 in Georgia, 1 in Texas, 1 in DC, and 1 in Trinidad. That's why she was able to say, I am somebody. And as an apostle, she planted churches. In conclusion, it took miracles, signs, and wonders. It took trials and tribulations to get Helen Smith, Apostle Helen Smith, to where the Lord wanted her. But indeed, her mom's words came true. You're going to be somebody. Helen was a wife. She was a mother, a biological mother of 4, Jackie, then Mendel, and I didn't tell the story about Mendel. Mendel died as an infant. Then there was Sharon, and then there was Michael. She also reared countless foster children. She was a cosmetologist. She was a student of the word. She was a preacher. She was a teacher. She was a Holy Ghost-filled visionary with unshakable faith and undeniable visions. But she paid a cost for following God. We're thankful to her life. All of her siblings were successful. They too became somebody, as her mom declared. And if you would show the slide, I have a few pictures of Helen. This is Helen with her son and her husband, Jimmy. This is her ministering. And this is her at the Revival Center, Canhoy Revival Center, that she built with her church family. And this is them praising the Lord in that place. And this is just the building that was there. And what you heard earlier when you came in was a CD by Helen's daughter, Sharon. Sharon Riley, who was a teacher at Beaufort High School, became Teacher of the Year in 1989, is her daughter. She also is a pastor in Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia. She pastors Faith Deliverance Christian Center there. She's Dr. Sharon Riley. Also, her son, Michael, is a minister of the gospel, and also he's a psalmist and writes music as well, and he also is a minister in Virginia. Sharon's sister lives up in New York, Jackie, but they all are successful. Sharon's song, Ask What You Will, I was a part of that choir that sang that song at the Gospel Jamboree. With Sharon, Helen's daughter, I was led to the Lord in her home. I met Helen Smith many, many years ago. Helen Smith died in August of 1999. Her book came out that same year. So she was a very remarkable woman. And this is what she said: whatever your circumstances, no matter how discouraged you may be, you can press on to win the prize. You can overcome impossible odds to become the successful person God created you to be. And thank God for her inspiring words and her inspiring book. And I pray that you were inspired by all that she went through, but was successful at the end, and how the Lord just used her to get his word out and to save people and to help others. Her story goes on, is much, much more in this book, but because of time constraints, I cannot give you all of it, but I'm telling you, this is very powerful, and it helped me when I first read this book as well. Would you play? This is a song. The first one you heard was by her daughter. Now this is by her son, Michael M. Smith. By the way, they learned how to play music, an instrumental, as a young child. The Lord taught them to play. They are well versed in these things.
See how good the Lord can be. So I gave him a try. Now I think that girl clapping my hands.
Are there any questions? And thank you for listening.
Come on, let me hear you again. I heard the call. See how good the
No. No, it was published in 1999. The books were distributed at her funeral. I went to her funeral, and that's where I bought my book. Yeah. Right. But Jimmy died earlier, too, before Helen. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. The Lord told her that she would fall away. He spoke with her when she was 16. Then he told her those things, but obviously she did not remember those things. When she went to live in Charleston, when she started going to movies, and she did try, I didn't say it, she did go out to clubs, but she didn't like it. She tried alcohol and didn't like it, so she did fall away. Yeah. She still has family in Beaufort County, but I don't know who they are right now. I keep in touch with Sharon Riley, her daughter, up in Virginia, as well as her son Michael, who's in Virginia now also. But I'm sure in Cainhoy, they have family as well.
Any other questions?
Well, one thing I see, and we have an organization called Carrie's Beaufort County Youth Conference, who does things like that. We bring our youth together and allow them to talk about issues and problems that they have, and also bring in people to do workshops for them. So one thing that you can do, not only through the conference, but we can gather our youth to talk with them as well, do some training. You can do training with our parents to help them. We can do training at the schools. Those things will help them to become stronger and to instill some other things in them as well, especially self-esteem, self-confidence. Our children need that, and I know that.
Any other questions? Okay, Carrie, thank you very much.
Just one other thing. One other thing, I think on the table you have some flyers for the Beaufort County Youth Conference that will, our youth plan the conference March 25th. It will be at TCL after COVID. This is our first time coming back in person for middle and high school youth. March 25th from 10 to noon at TCL. So we are inviting our middle and high school youth from all schools. So if you know a young person, please let them know about the conference planning. These young people plan what they want to know about. They plan their workshop titles. They plan the T-shirts theme and also T-shirt colors, everything. They're in control of what the conference is all about. And all we do is try to implement it and to bring professionals in, and that's September 23rd. We will have our 31st annual Beaufort County Youth Conference from what they plan March 25th.